I am super pleased to be here today to introduce your ILA convocation speaker, Dr. Dan McAdams. To give you a little bit of background information on who he is, he got his Bachelor of Science degree from Valparaiso University in Indiana, and after graduation, he continued on to get his doctorate degree from Harvard, working with David McClelland. For those of you who are going to go into psychology, David McClelland is kind of a big deal. He is now a full professor at Northwestern University in Chicago. In addition to Dr. McAdams' position as full professor, he also developed a research program titled Foley Center for the Study of Lives, wherein he and other researchers from other disciplines study the development and social variables of aging adults. His research broadly is on the self and identity, which is why he's here to talk to all of us today. He researches these topics primarily through studying individuals' life stories. This is also known as narrative identity. He has over 200 publications on this topic that are both peer-reviewed journal articles and books, one of which is a textbook for personality psychology titled The Person. So if you take personality psychology, you may be introduced to this book. This, I want to highlight, is an important area of research because the topic of trying to understand the self is a long-standing one. Philosophers as far back as written records go show interest in the self and identity. Dr. Dan McAdams is also a recipient of numerous grants and awards, more than I can list here. And honestly, without his conceptualization of the self and identity, which you're going to hear more about today, I don't know what I would be researching, because this is my area as well. But even with all of his accomplishments within the research domain, he is still a dedicated educator to undergraduate students. This, if you are familiar with research institutions, as Northwestern University is categorized as, many professors do little to no teaching for undergraduate students. Dr. Dan McAdams has mindfully chosen to continue teaching students. In fact, we could probably all learn something from his course titled How to Become an Adult. I know I could. In addition to teaching students within the classroom, he runs a research lab where undergraduate students are trained to identify different aspects of identity within life stories. This gives them an applied sense of personality and research combined into one program. So, in sum, Dr. Dan McAdams is not only a phenomenal researcher, but a devoted teacher. We are really lucky to have him here today to hear more about his work. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Dan McAdams.
I have to turn the mic on. You can hear me? You can hear me, okay. Never hug the person who is introducing you, as I just did, because it knocks your microphone out. Nice to be here. Great to be here. Oh. I want to begin with Harry Potter. In book 6, Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, we learn that the evil Lord Voldemort wants to live forever. In order to accomplish this feat, Voldemort splits his soul into pieces and hides them in objects, each piece. Even if his body is destroyed, he reasons, a piece of him will live on forever in the Horcrux, which is the name for any object in which a person has concealed part of his soul. Harry must find Voldemort's 7 Horcruxes and destroy them. Now, most of the wizards do not approve of Voldemort's efforts to attain immortality. You must understand, Professor Slughorn explains, that the soul is supposed to remain intact and whole. Splitting is an act of violation. It is against nature. As a young wizard, Voldemort is fascinated by this idea. How do you do it? He wants to know. How do you split your soul into pieces? By an act of evil, answers Slughorn. The supreme act of evil by committing murder. Killing rips the soul apart. So early in his wizarding career, Voldemort studies the darkest and most forbidden magic. He learns the specific spells that need to be invoked after you murder somebody, so that the piece of your soul that is torn off in the murder may be safely encased in the Horcrux. Now, the author here, J.K. Rowling, is suggesting that there is something horribly unnatural, something not quite human, about trying to split your soul into pieces. And so for muggles and wizards the world over, the soul symbolizes unity and wholeness in the person. Rather than split our souls into pieces, Professor Slughorn says, the natural thing to do is to bring yourself together, to bind yourselves together to unify your lives. But how would you do that? You could ask Professor Slughorn, how would you do that? How especially do we find unity and purpose in modern life when the world wants us to do so many things? How do you find your vocation, your calling, what you think you were meant to do and be in life? Now, I don't know what Professor Slughorn would say, but one option that I'd like to throw out at you this morning, and I think it's implicit in the book you're all reading, The Glass Castle, is to consider this idea that we create ourselves, we make ourselves whole through stories by constructing internalized and evolving life narratives. These stories are heavily shaped by culture. Indeed, we borrow from our culture to make our stories. These stories help to explain ourselves to each other and to ourselves, and they provide our kind of messed up lives with a certain kind of semblance of meaning and purpose. So I don't know, I'm pretty skeptical about the idea of a soul, but I do think we all have stories. Now actually that last sentence, we all have stories, isn't quite right. We don't all have stories. Most 8-year-old children do not have stories yet, at least not in the way I'm going to talk about it today. And my mother, I am sorry to say, suffering from advanced dementia in her early 90s, she no longer really has a story in her mind about how she came to be the person she is. And if you were here last night, you heard me entertain the hypothesis that perhaps President Trump does not have a story for his life. It's a hypothesis. Most of us begin to create stories during a particular time in our lives. That is to say, young adulthood. So let me talk for a few minutes this morning before I open it up for some questions from you all about this idea of creating a self through story. And I want to talk about it in the context of being a first-year student at Monmouth College in the year 2017, enrolled in the Introduction to the Liberal Arts. So this idea of a story, what we call a narrative identity, Tara mentioned it. It's an internalized and evolving story of the self that explains how I came to be the person I am becoming. You're all working on stories. You begin doing this, research suggests, in late adolescence and young adulthood. So now what does this story ultimately look at, this story that you've got in your mind? Well, I've got one. It's real simple. I can put it on one slide. It's actually kind of a boring story. But my story starts like this. I grew up in Gary, Indiana. You know Gary, Indiana? In the 1960s, a godforsaken place in my mind, not as bad as Welch, West Virginia, but pretty bad. I didn't like it there. I wasn't comfortable. I wanted to get out. I felt like I was a Martian, almost, planted in this place. What am I doing here? I had nice parents. I had a decent family life, but I really didn't like it, bored out of my mind. And so I escaped, thank God. I went really far away to Valparaiso University, 10 miles down the road. But it might as well have been Paris or Tokyo. I never went home after that. It was an emancipation for me. I got to Valparaiso University, and I was in this class, like this one, small class, though, and we started reading these great books, like Sigmund Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents, and a bunch of other essays and so forth. And I thought, whoa, this is really interesting. These great men and women throughout history, they've had this conversation going about the meaning of life and about human nature And isn't this kind of interesting that people have been talking about this stuff all this time? And you can read about it, and you can even be part of the conversation maybe someday, I thought, kind of in an immodest manner. I want to get in on this action. And I met this woman who you can't see too well in the middle there, Becky Paulmeyer, in that class while we were discussing Freud. And we started secretly seeing each other. Nobody knew. Eventually we got married. We're still married. And we had these two beautiful daughters on the right. And that's a pretty straightforward outline of my life story, to tell you the truth. Now, there's a lot more to it. It's not that cliched. There's some struggle. There's some setbacks. There's a lot of failures and so forth. But any way I think about my life, this framework is sort of in my head. Gary, Valpo, and onward. That's kind of how it was for me. We all develop narratives. They help us make sense of who we are, how we've come to be, and to make sense of the changes in our lives. And this is a central theme in the book that you're all reading these days for this particular class, The Glass Castle by Jeannette Walls, which I read over the last few weeks. And it occurs to me that Jeannette Walls has a lot to say here about narrative identity, about life stories. Let me pull a few sentences out of the book for you. I don't know how many of you have finished it. I don't know where you are in your reading, so there may be some spoiler alerts here, but Stephanie said it was okay if I did this. So here's the first sentence in the book. I was sitting in a taxi, wonder if I had overdressed for the evening, when I looked out the window and saw Mom rooting through a dumpster. That's such a great sentence. You're going to start a book like that, you've immediately grabbed the reader. Your mom is rooting through a dumpster. Okay, so I'm trying to picture this. And I went on the web, and I found a picture of Jeannette Walls, who today, she's an esteemed author. She's also worked as a gossip columnist for MSNBC, I believe. And this is her looking through a window in a car. Now, this isn't the scene, the actual scene from the beginning of the book, but it is a picture of her in a car, and I'm imagining her looking out the window, and I'm imagining what she sees, okay? And what she sees is her past, when she sees her mother. And so I pulled this image off the internet, and it claims to be associated with the book The Glass Castle, and indeed Welch, West Virginia. And I'm not convinced this is the actual house that they lived in the second half of the book, if you've gotten that far, in Welch, West Virginia. But it looked a lot like this. And she's looking at that, in a sense, metaphorically. And we're wondering, or she's wondering, actually, we don't know, because we're just on sentence one. But she's wondering, how did I get from there to there, from the left to the right? And the book basically tells you how she got there, okay? But it's not straightforward. It's not like a chronicle. There's a lot of interpretation. There's a lot of narrating and making sense that goes into that journey. Now let's look at the last sentence of the book. Right? At this point, I told you I'd spoil things for you, but her father has passed away. Yeah, he dies, sorry. And some of you don't sound too upset. And this is Thanksgiving, 5 years later, after he's passed away, right? And they're sitting around talking about old Rex. We should drink a toast to Rex, John said. John is her husband. Mom stared at the ceiling. Mom's still kicking. Miming perplexed thought. I've got it. She held up her glass. Life with your father was never boring. We raised our glasses. I could almost hear Dad chuckling at Mom's comment in the way he always did when he was truly enjoying something. It had grown dark outside. A wind picked up. Rattling the windows and the candle flames suddenly shifted, dancing along the border between turbulence and order. Now, this is a beautiful ending, in part because that last phrase, the border between turbulence and order, has been used earlier in the book. There's a scene earlier in the book where Jeannette and her brother are like in this shack, and it kind of blows up. There's a lot of fires in this story. This shack like blows up, and it goes up in flames, And Jeannette runs out, but her brother is going to stick behind, and her dad just happens to be coming by, Rex. And he goes in and pulls the kid out of the building, and they're looking at the flames. And Rex sees the flames up as the thing's going up. And he says, you know, because Rex, the father, has this science background. You know, that space, that part of the air where the flame hits the air, that's like a border. That's the border between turbulence and order. And there are no rules in that space, the father says. It's kind of interesting idea about the border between turbulence and order. I've tried to picture it here. The border between turbulence and order. Turbulence is kind of the way our lives go, and order, well, we're trying to make sense of our lives. Maybe it's like this. There are life events that occur. Things happen in our lives that we don't predict, and sometimes they're great, and sometimes they're terrible, and sometimes it's hard to know which. But they don't really follow a pattern, because let's face it, life is pretty random. But we need to make order out of it. We need to write it out in our heads, make a story. And so the story is neat and clean. Life is dirty and crazy and all mixed up. And we sort of live in between, if you will. Between what's happening in our world and the story we are creating. That is between turbulence on the one hand and order on the other. Now, how do you make order out of turbulence? There are lots of examples in the book of how the author does this. I want to give you a few of them here. She transforms life events, the turbulence of life, into story, into narrative. Here's the first sentence of the first chapter after we flash back away from New York, and now they're out west. She's a little girl. She's 3 years old, remember? She's standing at the stove making hot dogs. Her dress catches on fire. I was on fire. It was my earliest memory. Now, what is the meaning of this? Well, I'll tell you one meaning many readers would make, myself included, and that is this is a chaotic and deprived childhood that this little girl is living in. There's a lot of parental neglect, I would say, bordering on the criminal. Her mom lets her do this. As you know in the story, their parents let them do all kinds of stuff. Put them in harm's way oftentimes. And so for some readers, you say, you know, oh my God. So what this means is this is a really, really bad childhood. Here's how she makes sense of it. Here's how she makes sense of it. Jeannette, I lived in a world that at any moment could erupt into fire. It was the sort of knowledge that kept you on your toes. Now think of all the different kind of meanings you could have made out of that. I live in a world wherein at any moment things can go up in flames. Oh my God, this is a horrible world. I better hide. I better be really, really careful. I'm not sure I can make it. That's not the meaning she's making. She's almost saying, isn't this kind of cool? You got to be ready, man. You got to have that knowledge and vigilance. Anything can happen. Makes it kind of exciting. Makes it sort of interesting. A narrative of adventure and resilience. That's what she's living, she wants to tell you. Not sure I would have made that meaning out of it as a little 3-year-old or later, but that is the meaning that she's beginning to make. That's the story she's starting to tell. That's the order that she's giving to the turbulence. Well, let's talk about her father. And I have a hard time talking about her father in a rational way. I have to admit to you, I hated the guy. I really, really did. I knew guys like him when I was a kid, although not this bad. And I always hated them. Now, obviously she doesn't, and I respect her point of view. Mine's just one. I'm an irrational, subjective reader. Here's what she says. In my mind, Dad was perfect, although he did have what Mom called a little bit of a drinking situation. Well, as you go through the novel, you find out it's more than a little bit of a drinking situation. Her father is a raging alcoholic. And later in the book, and I don't know if you've gotten here yet, but this is just astounding, he basically tries to pimp his daughter. It's incredible, in a bar. And don't forget the cheetah. I don't know if you've gotten that far either, but he takes the kids to the zoo, and he climbs over the fence, and he pets the cheetah, and he has his daughter take her hand and pet the cheetah, and the daughter thinks, oh, this is so thrilling and exciting. And that cheetah's about to bite her arm off, but he doesn't, because they got lucky, in my opinion. And the rangers or the officials come in and kick him out, and oh my God. Or one of the worst scenes in the book, towards the end, or 2/3 of the way through, the kids are saving up money, and they're putting it in a piggy bank because they got to get out of here. They've got to get out of Welch, West Virginia. They're going to escape to New York. At this point, they're teenagers, and they do eventually. But they're saving up money for the trip. And this is so much work, and it's so hard, and you are rooting for them so hard as a reader. And the father comes in, steals the money, and goes and blows it on drinking. I wanted to kill the guy at that point. It was a very, very tough thing, okay? Here's how she makes sense of these things. Well, my daddy told me I was his favorite child, but he made me promise not to tell Lori or Brian or Maureen. It was our secret. I swear, honey, there are times when I think you're the only one around who still has faith in me, he said. I don't know what I'd do if you ever lost it. I told him that I would never lose faith in him, and I promised myself I never would. She kind of does lose faith in him eventually, but she sticks with him all the way through. In a weird way, she admires him. He's a kind of rugged American individualist. He's a kind of crazy type of guy that means well, doesn't follow the rules. America's got a lot of guys like him. They're rugged. They're tough. They think outside the box. And she creates a narrative of loyalty and fidelity to this man. No way I would have created that story if I were doing it. But hey, this isn't my story. This isn't my life. This isn't my narrative identity. This is Janet Walls, or her mother, perhaps the most complicated character in the book. Here's her mother. So the trouble you kids get into with Billy Deal was actually a blessing in disguise. This is a scene early on where things actually are going really pretty well here at in this town that they've been in for about 6 months, Mountain, I can't think of the name of it right now. But then Billy Deal, who's really a loser, basically tries to rape the heroine, Jeannette, is unsuccessful. They're like 11 years old or something when this happens. And so later on, Billy Deal shows up and he starts shooting at them with a BB gun. Jeannette and her brother go and get the gun, like a real gun, and start shooting at him. They don't get him, but the kid gets away. The police get called in. They're all in trouble now, and it's time to do the skedaddle, as her dad says. We got to get the heck out of town now because of this. And her mom is saying, you know, it's kind of good that happened, that thing with Billy Deal, because now we can get out of town and we're going to head on to Phoenix, where it turns out her family has 2 homes, and they're going to live in one of them, and life's going to be better. I'm such an excitement addict, she says. We're off to another adventure. Jeannette, isn't this wonderful? Mom's eyes were bright. I'm such an excitement addict. All right, so what kind of interpretation do you want to make of Mother? Now, this is one you could make by the time you get to the middle of the book. Mother is sometimes so divorced from reality as to appear psychotic. And her reasoning is weirdly Pollyannish. The worst kind of stuff can happen. Really, really bad stuff. We're living in this hellhole in Welch. This house is unbelievably screwed up. And the kids complain. She goes, you know, children in Ethiopia would love to live in this house. And this constant sort of thing with the mom, you know, always trying to find something positive. Even when Uncle Stanley starts groping her daughter, Jeannette, the mother says, well, you know, Uncle Stanley, he's lonely, he's had a tough life. She excuses it. The guy's groping her daughter. And so Jeannette goes, man, Mom, you'd excuse anything. Like, what about Hitler? She goes, well, you know, Hitler, he loved dogs. Okay. Whoa. I don't know if Hitler loved dogs. It doesn't redeem him in my mind, nor in the history books. Oh, and I forgot to mention, she's probably manic depressive, if you want to go psychological on it, bipolar disorder. She's got to have one. This is one messed up lady who many would say is not up to the challenges of motherhood. We learn later in the book she chose poverty for herself and, more importantly, for her kids. She's got money in Texas. They've got land there worth $1 million. Sell it or sell the house in Phoenix. No, you got to hold on to your land. They never got around to selling the house. She chose poverty. It's really hard for me, as a man who's raised 2 children, who lived in a tough town, although nothing like Welch, to kind of like say, wow, isn't this a great lady? But she does have positive features, this mother. She's not all bad. There's many really, really good things about her, and these get accentuated in this story in some ways, and some ways not. So Mom was 38 at this point, not young, not old either. This is Jeannette writing. In 25 years, I told myself I'd be as old as she was now. Jeanette's 13. I had no idea what my life would be like then, but as I gathered my school books and walked out the door, I swore to myself that it would never be like Mom's, that I would not be crying my eyes out in an unheated shack in some God-forsaken holler. Yeah? This is pretty negative here, but there are other positive scenes too. And the general kind of view of Mom that you get is that she's this like almost godly innocent. She's this pure artistic soul. She's always painting these beautiful pictures and so forth. And in a way, Jeannette kind of likes that. Sort of sees some virtue and positivity in that. And I think even I did, as a very skeptical reader who did not like these parents. Although for me, the dad was way worse. Just for me, though. Here's Jeannette and her mother. Today, or a few years ago, I guess, that book has been written. The mom and dad has died, but the mom is still doing okay, and she's painting. And this is a nice, happy, domestic scene. How did Jeannette do it? Like, step back. How many people could have gone all the way, as Jeannette did, from her background, completely deprived childhood, to becoming a successful writer, a successful journalist, living in New York with, as we learn by the end of the book, a really great husband? She's a great success story, but like, how did she do it? We sort of want to know, like, what did she have going for her that made her pull this off? Well, first of all, I think you have to say that there was a lot of luck. There's always luck, or bad luck. This is good luck. She had a lot of bad luck, too. I mean, these 2 parents. But there was a lot of good luck. A lot of kindness that other people offered the family. I don't know if you've been there yet, but there's this wonderful scene where this year they're going to do Christmas on Christmas Day. Usually they don't. Usually they do Christmas like a week later because they can get, find old trees and so forth. But this year they're going to do it on Christmas Day. And I think the day before, Christmas Eve, they're going out to buy a tree. And the trees are like $3. But the guy says, hey, lady, here, take this one for $1. Just a nice gesture from a guy selling trees. He decides not to charge the mom full price. Here, take the tree. Or some of the teachers at the school. They find out Jeannette doesn't have money for lunch. Don't worry, honey, somebody paid for you. Nobody paid for her. They're just letting her in. They're cutting her some slack. They're feeling sorry for this little girl who has to root through garbage cans to get food in junior high. Or there's a really great scene with Chuck Yeager later in the book. Chuck Yeager, the famous test pilot, who was from West Virginia, came back to speak to the high school. It's really dramatic. And Jeannette, who's on the newspaper now, she gets to interview him. This is a great moment for Jeannette because for one of the first times in the school, she gets real respect from everybody else because Chuck Yeager is the coolest guy ever. And she gets this great interview, and he's so kind to her. He is so nice. So there's a lot of scoundrels in this book, but there are some people who go above and beyond and do some really nice things. So there's a lot of luck. There's also something that I guess you would call grit, or what psychologists call conscientiousness. This little girl is blessed with some real stick-to-itiveness. It's an incredible narrative of her ability to be an agent, to actually want something and make it happen. She is not going to be like her mom, she has decided. The power of the will. Towards the end, very end of the book, she's in a class, And they're talking about poverty, you know, and everybody's, you know, is it because of the corrupt social system we have? Is it because of capitalism? Why do we have poverty? And Jeannette says, I think that maybe sometimes people get the lives they want. And the whole class are like, whoa, you some right-wing crazy? What's wrong with you? Impoverished people are victims. Come on. Well, she's been an impoverished person, and they're victims, but sometimes they get what they want. She's suggesting her parents really wanted the life they had. It's not the life she wanted, and she's going to get a different kind of life. School, hugely positive influence on this little girl, especially her working on the newspaper. I began to feel, this is like 7th grade, I began to feel like I was getting the whole story for the first time, that I was being handed the missing pieces to the puzzle, and the world was making a little more sense. This is really a powerful thing. And finally, reading and appropriating cultural narratives. This is a really interesting family. They sit around and read all night. It's great. There's some beautiful scenes where the family, they're all reading. And the mom's reading, you know, Faulkner. And I mean, this is a high-level family. The dad has a lot of scientific knowledge and knows how to do things. I mean, he's not a dumb guy. He's had a lot of really good jobs. He loses them because of problems in self-regulation and alcohol and so forth. But he's blessed with a lot of intelligence. After all, he did get out of Welch. It's where he grew up. The kids all read, and they read different kinds of things. Lori, the older daughter, reads escapist literature, like Harry Potter maybe, and like Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings back then. Harry Potter hadn't been around. In the case of our heroine, Jeannette, she reads stories about overcoming adversity, like The Grapes of Wrath, and a tree grows in Brooklyn, and she identifies with the characters in those stories. She identifies with what I call American narratives of redemption. And this is one of the really cool things, I believe, about American society writ large. And the whole world looks to us in some admiration and also sometimes with skepticism about the kind of narratives we as a people create for life, the redemptive quality of those stories. In a redemption story, the heroine or hero is delivered from suffering to a positive status or state. I grew up in depravity, but I come out of it better. I come out of it stronger. Now, to her credit, Jeanette's mother is always spinning these little redemptive stories. You know, if it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger. A couple of times the kids almost got killed, but it did make them stronger, you could argue, right? You don't believe in medicine, you know? Well, we don't believe in the medical system. You just fight those diseases on your own. Yeah, you eat a little poison, you get better because your body adapts to it. I mean, there's all these weird things that happen like that. Some of them are real distortions of reality, but at the same time, there's this kind of message coming across that, you know, if you persevere hard enough, if you're like the heroes, the protagonists of The Grapes of Wrath, or some of these fabulous stories of overcoming adversity that we Americans know and love, stories that go back even to our Puritan heritage, go back to the Revolution, go back to Benjamin Franklin, go back to stories of like escaped slaves in the 19th century, the slave narratives, and what did they overcome? Oh my God, getting over the Ohio River to freedom. What greater escape could there be? What greater redemption? What greater move from negative to positive? We all know these stories. They're captured in Hollywood. They're captured by Oprah. Her own life story is like this, but she also teaches people how to tell stories of redemption, stories in which, if you work hard enough, you can recapture that goodness that you had once upon a time. But hey, I've been abused. I've been an addict. I've lost my way. And Oprah says, that's all right. There's goodness in you. You just have to go back and find it. It's there. You will find it. It's the same message that Ralph Waldo Emerson told in the 19th century when he barnstormed across the American East, giving sermons and inspirational, motivational talks to farmers and business persons and so forth about how you have to focus on that good inner light inside of you and find it, and no matter how bad things get, you can be redeemed. stories of striving for success, Horatio Alger stories, immigrant stories, going from rags to riches, the good ones, the good immigrant stories, the stories about how they made it, because many times immigrants don't make it. And many times they get sent away, as we know, and as we're seeing today in the current administration. But some of the greatest stories in American heritage are about immigrants coming to this country with nothing, a penny, nothing. And they work hard and they build a life, and their kids take advantage of that. Their kids are blessed, are able to go on and do well. And voila, 2-3 generations down the road, you've got these tremendous American success stories. Or religious stories in American society, Christian stories mainly, about overcoming temptation, about going from sin to salvation. We all know these narratives. They're powerfully redemptive. And I think Jeannette Walls is calling upon that literary canon. She has a sense of these stories, and she's making her life into one of these. Not many people could do this, but she pulls it off, as we see in the book. In my own research on this last slide here, I study the extent to which people are able to make their lives into redemptive stories. It's not easy to do. Not everybody can do it. And sometimes things are just so screwed up in your life that you can't. I mean, there's just no way to make a redemptive narrative out of it. Nonetheless, people are ingenious and creative, as we see in the case of Jeannette Walls, and oftentimes are able to find positive meanings in the suffering that they have experienced. And so we've been doing research on this for a long time, and we have people tell us their life stories, normal people, everyday people, usually people like in their 30s and 40s and 50s, a little older than you, but sometimes people as young as you. And they tell these narratives about their life and their high points, their low points, and their turning points in life, and we got a whole protocol. And then we analyze the texts, and we assign numbers or scores to the interviews. And you get an index of how much redemption imagery there is in the life story. And a lot of people have done this kind of work. Tara is involved in it to a certain extent. Her advisor, Will Dunlop at University of California, Riverside. A number of different professors who study narrative identity. And what the research shows is that creating redemptive life stories in adulthood, it's a good thing. It's associated with positive personality traits, for example. It's associated with happiness and psychological well-being. And it's associated with an idea called generativity, which is basically, in a nutshell, the extent to which you're trying to make the world a better place. People who tell redemptive life stories, the research suggests, are often committed to trying to make the world a better place through their kids, through their family, through their work. Generativity is a great virtue of adulthood. So these redemptive stories are powerful in our society. They oftentimes move us to sustain hope, to affirm that there are, down the road, there's a kind of optimistic end that we can find. It doesn't always work out that way. Sometimes turbulence overwhelms order. But in many lives, it's possible to walk that line between turbulence and order, and amidst all the chaos, to create some kind of positive meaning out of it all. And for some of you, perhaps many of you in this room, that's your challenge as you go forward. Thank you. So we have about 8 minutes or so here for questions, and I would love to answer some of your questions. So don't be shy. I can see you, sort of, with these lights in my eyes. Yes, ma'am. Shout it out. Yes. Yeah, good question. So the issue has to do with Sigmund Freud. You people who know a little bit of psychology know he's this famous psychoanalytic theorist from the latter part of the 19th century, beginning part of the 20th, and I cited his book, Civilization and Its Discontents, as a really important book for me. And Freud was an intellectual giant. There is no doubt about that, and had a profound effect on how I think about people's lives. I'm not, however, a psychoanalyst. I don't follow that tradition in research so much, and I don't really follow what's called the behaviorist tradition either. I would say, to the extent I draw on Freud, Freud had an appreciation for stories, for like dreams, for example. And he was always looking for the hidden meanings behind the dreams. And he had these really elaborate interpretive hermeneutical processes that, you know, really, really complicated kinds of interpretive moves you could make to make sense of stories. That's too hard for me and most researchers. We try to make it a little simpler by creating coding systems to evaluate narratives and assign scores to them. So we're kind of doing a little bit about what Freud did, but we're trying to do it in a scientific way, in a way that's reliable. So I guess in some ways this research owes a little bit to Freud in that regard. But I think the main influence of Freud on me is that he asked the big questions about human nature and individual differences, and he wrote about it in such a beautiful way, overwhelmingly beautiful way. So I think for me, that's his influence. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Good point. Okay, so the question has to do with really serious psychological disorders like schizophrenia or dissociative disorders. Dissociative disorders are really, really weird. They're the kinds of things where you feel like you're split in two. There's two personalities to you. A lot has been written about that. These are relatively rare phenomena, but nonetheless extraordinarily debilitating. People who suffer from schizophrenia and from dissociative identity disorders, they've got bigger problems than creating a redemptive story for their lives. They're at a level where they just have to find some daily coherence in everyday life. If I'm walking through the world and I'm hearing voices, they're telling me to kill people, who cares if I've got a redemptive story? I got to get rid of those voices. So these are much more serious problems, I think. And I don't think that narrative psychology has a lot to say in terms of helping people with those particular illnesses. I think there are ways to reach them. There is some research on the life narratives told by schizophrenics and so forth. To nobody's surprise, these stories are very chaotic. They don't have a lot of coherence. As people's symptoms remit, as they get better, their life stories get a little bit more coherent. But it would be really hard to make that happen, say, one-on-one with a person. There are moments in the Glass Castle where I got to thinking, you know, some of the stuff these parents say, it's really delusional. Like this whole idea about the Glass Castle. I mean, come on. He's going to build this beautiful glass castle. He's going to do it in West Virginia. The kids dig a hole for the foundation. The old man pours garbage into the hole. That's how they use the hole. So maybe in his kind of deluded states, he would occasionally have these great ideas about the glass castle, but there's never any follow-through. It's probably not psychosis. It's just probably the effects of alcohol. Yeah, in those kind of extreme situations, the kind of things I'm describing here are somewhat secondary. There are bigger problems to deal with. Yes, ma'am. Okay, so the question is, what made me go into the field of narrative psychology? And the second is, what's the most interesting thing I've discovered? I'm going to sound like a real jerk. I invented the field of narrative psychology, okay? So I didn't just go into it. Now, other people did too. But this was my big thing in the 1980s. Like, I was teaching classes on Erik Erikson, some of you know who he is, developmental psychology, and I was like, what is an identity? People have been writing about identity for a long time. And I'm asking the students, if you could see an identity, what would it look like? And eventually it occurs to me, and some of the students, it would look like a story. Yeah, it would look like a story. Because a story integrates things in time and makes order out of the turbulence. So there were other people writing about this too, but it wasn't like it was a field I went into. It was kind of an idea that I developed and that many other people have developed along the way. So yeah, some immodesty there. I'm sorry to do that. The second thing, what's my best discovery? I think this is my best discovery. And it's not just me. A lot of people have done this work. The idea that a lot of positive things come from redemptive life stories. That if you can create meaning in your life that shows how you've overcome adversity, it's linked to some positive outcomes. That's probably my best thing. And I share that with many. Yes, ma'am?
So first, what lens are you looking at in redemption? Like, are you saying in terms of career, like you're using like a spiritual lens? Like, what kind of like allows you to bring redemption from what to what?
From what to what? Yeah, good question. All right, so, and this will probably be our last question because I think we're at the time when we're supposed to end. The question is, what contexts are you looking at redemption in? Is it like career or relationships and so forth? And we look at them all kinds of different contexts, okay? You could experience redemption in work, in play, in relationships, but there's some classic moves, and at least 4 that I find especially powerful in American cultural narratives. There's the move from sin to salvation. I call that atonement. There are millions of Americans walking around with born-again stories about how they've gone from sin to salvation. I grew up in a church that had that kind of narrative tradition. Those are powerful stories. George W. Bush, President Bush, had a story like that. It turned his life around in a very positive way. So that's one. A second one is the kind of rags to riches, American success story type narrative. All right? I got a little bit of that. I grew up in Gary, Indiana. It wasn't like Welch, as I said, but we were pretty poor. No one had ever gone to college. It was kind of a bedraggled place. And voila, now here I am. I get to talk to smart people like you. That's an upward mobility story for me, okay? It's like going not from rags to riches, but from kind of being downtrodden to a position of esteem and excitement. The third, and for me the most powerful, are stories of liberation, where you go from slavery to freedom. Now, probably nobody in the room has ever literally been enslaved, but people will often talk about parts of their lives that way, as if they were trapped and couldn't get out. And we have powerful examples in American cultural history. Stories of escaped slaves, stories of progressive movements like the women's movement, the movement for gay rights. Both of those movements, American cultural movements, rely on narratives of liberation, of expanding and getting away from oppressive social structures. So I think that's a third powerful one. And the last one is Oprah's story, what I would call redemptive narratives of recovery, where once upon a time I was fine. I was healthy, I was pure, I was good, and then I lost it. I got sick, I started drinking, I got abused, I messed up my life, or other people messed it up, and now I'm trying to get back that goodness that I lost. Those 4, atonement, upward mobility, emancipation or liberation, and recovery, I think are very powerful cultural narratives for redemption. There's others too, but those are the 4 that I like. Thank you all. I enjoyed speaking to you.